Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Cohen, the author of An Introduction to the Art and Science of Chinese Tea Ceremony. Today, we're discussing Book 2, Chapter 3, Section 6, Communist to Contemporary Era Yixing History. Here to talk about this chapter is our editorial team, Patrick Penny.
Hey, hey.
And Zongzun Li.
大家好.
Hello, Pat. Hello, Zongzun. Before we jump in, perhaps an extended aside. This was another very difficult chapter to write. This chapter was published about a month late. And so we discussed in the last chapter in the last editorial conversation, how difficult this part of history is to research and to write about, and how difficult it was for me to publish the last chapter on ROC. So for this editorial conversation on this chapter, I wanted to turn that question on you and ask, how did you as editors and fact checkers deal with this violent and sad period that's still so important to Yixing history?
Well, personally, to me, this was a very turbulent and sad part of contemporary Chinese history, intertwined with a lot of mass movements and destruction of traditional art and societal structure at the time. Research of such topic is not going to be easy. A lot of the informations are either buried or revised. A lot of details needs to be dug out from multiple sources, and it's just not easy to digest, knowing the context of what's going on and what comes afterwards.
And this isn't ancient history to you, right? Your parents were alive during the transition to the communist era.
Yeah, luckily still alive. Yeah, but very recent history. I mean, like a lot of parts of my families were, heavily involved in a lot of the movements back in the days. We have family members coming from, artists or, scientist background, which were not necessarily popular at the time. But a lot of the similar scenarios also apply to Yixing artists at that day.
Yeah, I mean, we just go back 60 years, and I mean, you've got things like the what's called poorly named Great Leap Forward, right? So many examples of very difficult times within this very small slice of history. Shameful enough as it is to say, I think I tried to not dive too deep. I'm aware of the context, but I think I tried to be, let's call it as sterile and surgical as possible in my fact checking, because it is such a difficult time, I think, to face and to really understand and empathize with. So I feel very lucky to have Zongjun and Nancy also behind the scenes doing some of the editing, allowing me to be, I think, a little bit less emotionally invested, as I've seen all three of you be with this chapter, because I think it's a very difficult period of time to put that investment into. So I really tried to check numbers and dates without diving too much further.
Speaking of sad and violent periods, the transition from the ROC into the communist era wasn't the end of the tribulations. The Cultural Revolution period saw the mass destruction of culture and artifacts with the arbitrary and punitive enforcement of Mao's directive to stamp out the four olds, the old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. So how did the culture of tea and Yixing survive this period? Why do we still have them? Why do we still practice this culture today?
I think we should all feel very lucky, right? That as much has survived of tea culture and tea artifacts as we have to this point, but we definitely have to recognize that a lot was probably lost during that time period. I mean, as you write in the book, many reference pieces were certainly destroyed, even within the F1 factory. I think we just need to be very thankful that the craft made it to where it is today. But to answer your question, I think part of the way it did make it through the Cultural Revolution was the shift, from more of an artistic practice that was rooted in the culture of the literati to becoming something that was commoditized and made for the everyday man, which had no artist recognition attached to it. I think it was through adapting to what they needed to adapt to make it through the Cultural Revolution that we still, thankfully to this day, have Yixing as an art form.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that, the commercialization and the deculturalization of, Yixing wares really helped Yixing survive as an art form throughout that period of time. Like all the collectivization of Yixing production into the factories, selling for, exportations to gain foreign reserves. This practice really, helped Yixing to be considered not being eradicated by the authorities at the time as a existence. So I think masters and craftsmen at the time, they probably really had a lot of hard time making the decision that give away a lot of the traditional values in order to adapt into the new system and then help the art survive to this day.
I like the choice of words, deculturalization. Jason, you're a very cultured man. Looking at the background where Zongzun is taking the call, it's in your apartment. There's a lot of art on the wall. You're particularly interested in revolutionary art and protest art. During this period of time, as we see teapots becoming more of a commodity and a commercial item and less of a piece of artwork, would you consider, now that we're looking back, teapots of this time period to still be art? Is it communist art? Is there a label attached to it? Or are these truly just commodities? What is your viewpoint of Yixing from this period in time?
The communist government certainly attempted to turn Yixing into a craft. They certainly attempted to remove and reduce and erase the literati culture that gave rise to Yixings and the use of Yixings and the traditions around Yixings. Interestingly, in the early part of the communist era, they did collectivization. They did help revitalize the industry. They showered it with funds and resources in order to do mining and extraction. They invested in increasingly industrialized mines. They invested in innovations and changes in the method of firing. They drastically increased production. But at the same time, right, they took many of the traditions and the methodologies out of the hands of the Yixing masters. It used to be an apprenticeship system. They removed the apprenticeship system and they said, these are craftsmen, these are your apprentices, and these are, the six masters. And so deculturalization is an appropriate term. And at the same time, was there pushback? Did those six masters, maybe the seventh master, did they make art? The answer to that is absolutely, right? They honed their craft, they honed their skills frequently in the ROC, frequently forging older wares and making their own tributes to older wares, Fenggu style. And the production of Yixings, while it changed, and while there was certainly wares that are merely craft, right? There many of the higher end productions by the individuals still recognized as masters. Everyone's going to mention Gu Jingzhou, right? But many others are certainly merit art. When you see the communist era teapots that have a picture of Mao and inscriptions of Mao, right? That is obviously craft. But when you see the beautiful naturalistic wares, right, made by Ren Genting and others, certainly art. So spoke a little bit there. We touched on this, that there was a change, there was a deculturalization, right, increasing commercialization. But what was the role of the interests in the elites of the communist era? We're used to thinking about the elites as the literati, right? The majority of the earlier parts of this book and the last book was all about dynastic period China, the literati culture that gave rise to tea and the use of tea wares. But in the communist period, right, you had proletariat revolution, you had individuals, Mao Zedong, Gang of Four, who had their own preferences, their own opinions, right? How did their interests, how did their preferences and the preferences of the elite in the communist era influence tea and Yixing?
I would say that one thing that ceramics are a little bit different than some of the other arts or art forms that suffered through that period of time is that there's still a very important functional component of ceramics and teapots, right? Like people still need to drink tea, people need to brew tea, and in order to brew tea, you need to have teapots. And drinking tea has been, part of a very important social etiquette in a lot of interactions between, government officials or even a lot of, civilian culture life at that time. And Mao himself likes to drink tea, right? Like all of these, I think, really helped the authorities to make the decision that, this cannot be eradicated and it will, continue to survive throughout the period of time.
Well, I think that's the key, right? That Mao liked tea. And because Mao liked tea, it was not considered one of the four holds. And in fact, Mao went around to the tea farms and actually did some tea promotion. And there's propaganda posters of Mao standing in the tea fields with smiling people, right? So the collectivization of the tea promotion of tea culture actually continued.
It's a lot of transformation of the narrative, right? Whereas Yixing may have once been a tool of the literati, something that was seen as a higher art form for enjoying a cultural practice. Through, as you were just mentioning, collectivization, right? The communist government changes the narrative on what Yixing is. It becomes a symbol of, look at how well we're able to collectivize, right? These craftsmen, how efficiently we're able to produce this. Isn't that the triumph of, Chinese socialism? So it's really a changing of the narrative of what Yixing was to what that government wants Yixing to be and to be seen as, right? I think that's a big part of how they leveraged it as a propaganda tool in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Like once a, prestigious art form only made accessible to the literatis, and now, art or a craft for the people. That was the main narrative for a lot of collectivization at that time.
Yeah, one related question on this topic. What was the role of export and international demand in sustaining the production and artistic development of Yixing?
Well, one very important component for that practice is, earning foreign reserve. Early in the forming of the PRC, there weren't a lot of foreign import-export tradings at the time. Be able to sell ceramics overseas will certainly help the government to be able to gain a lot of foreign reserves at the time for trading and other business practices.
Who are they trading with? Who is buying Yixing teapots? We don't go to Britain and see high tea served out of Yixing. Who was buying them if not China and domestic Chinese use and consumption?
The Chinese diaspora certainly was still purchasing it. And so individuals who were in, Malaysia and then as far southeast, places like Thailand, et cetera, were buying these wares, which were now probably quite suppressed in price due to the commoditization, but also potentially lack of demand from other countries that previously during ROC, right, would have been purchasing them.
Places like the US, a lot of the wares get sold to older Chinatown tea shops at the time. And also, till still these days, you will find a lot of, mass collections of revolution era ceramics in Southeast Asian countries.
Note on that, I don't think that there was any importation of Yixing into United States after the communist era, because the United States didn't renormalize trade relations with China until 1972. So ROC probably around early 1920s, United States believe it cuts off predominant trade with China, and it didn't pick back up until 1972. So there would have been later F1 wares, but not early F1 wares traded in the United States.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Well, switching the topic. So we've spoken all about the negatives and the hardships, and we're going to continue to do that. But there seems to have been at least something to it, because despite all of these hardships in this time period, the Yixing wares of F1 are still highly sought after today. Why is this so? Why did this difficult period produce wares sought after by practitioners and collectors?
It's a great question. I don't know that I know the answer, honestly, because as we look around, and we've talked about previously on the podcast, as you look at a lot of tea social media, particularly in the West, F1 wares are into high demand. And I've watched, just over my short tenure and being interested in tea about the past 12 years, I've watched the prices within the Western market for F1 pots go from, 2 figures to 3 figures, and now for higher quality wares, or in many cases, more so, I would say, late Qing, early ROC, but occasionally F1 wares 4-digit price points, which blows my mind thinking about what I saw, 12 years ago. So I don't really know. I have had the chance to use some F1 pots. I can't say that I'm so experienced to know exactly the quality level between all of the periods. I've had the chance to use a few, and they produce good tea, but did they produce tea that was so comparatively better to some of the other Yixing wares I've been able to use? In my opinion, no. And so I'm not sure I can really answer the question.
For me, I think there are two components why some of the F1 wares are highly sought after. The first one will be that there are certainly some level of technique refinement that have been going on that period of time, right? People start to learn directly from the famous masters, ceramic masters, like Gu Jingzhou, Jiang Rong, Ren Ganting, and all of the famous big names in the history. And then mining of higher quality Yixing clays has been gradually increased due to the industrialization of mining techniques. So we would definitely see some level of improvements to some of the wares that were produced at the time compared to previous eras. Also, we are seeing some level of systemization of the labeling of the teapots and the productions, right? We're seeing different kind of labels for different eras of teapots, which provide, I think, greater traceability of certain teapots that can be attributed to certain artists or certain barricades of craftsmen at the time. So I think that really helps, at least from a commercial standpoint, like people trying to give valuations to certain teapots, trying to resell the teapots in the market. They will have a better, more verification point to prove their claims. I think that's reasons why F1 teapots were highly sought after.
That's a great point. So you identified a couple of different factors that went through periods of refinement or cycles of refinement in the F1 period, right? You said apprenticeship, because there was the 6 masters who had apprentices who were producing higher quality wares. You mentioned mining, systemization, so that everyone was producing similar forms, so repetitive production of forms formed better forms, better refinement over time, particularly at the master or apprentice level. You didn't mention firing, but firing was a big portion of that. So all of these types of systemizations led to arguably improvements, right? Are they improved? Do we believe that Qing Dynasty or ROC teapots are superior to F1, or F1 isn't monolithic and there's some variations in there?
I think it's exactly what you just said. I don't think F1 is monolithic. We know there's a wide range of variation, and certainly the teapots that I've mentioned that I saw go for 4 figures from the F1 period, right? There's a reason for it, whether or not I agree with the increase in price in recent years. And it's because those are probably the grand cru of that time period. So there's a wide range, partially due to, I think, particularly the period that we talked about a lot in the beginning, the Cultural Revolution period, where we have a lot of changes in what clay can be used by what level of title you have, right? Where previously, if you were a Grand Master, you were going to be able to select from the highest quality clays and put your own name on the pot, to going into the Cultural Revolution period where all clay was kind of batched together in larger batches, and you could have a variety of quality levels that were all being mixed together, and everything was being used by potters across all levels. Coming back out, I think, into the later F1 period, we have a lot of the innovation and technique that Zongzun was previously mentioning. So certainly as you go across the periods, there is not a cut and dry, that one period was better than the other. There's a lot of range, I think, between it.
I certainly agree with you. I believe, people talk about, they talk about decades, right? But it's really mid to late 60s, and then 70s through 77, 72 and 77 were big transition years. And you get into the 80s, into the end of the F1 period, and the 90s, and then it limps along into the 2000s. But certainly the quality of the material, the artisanship, the firing methodologies were all undergoing great levels of flux. And K.S. Lowe, who we write about in this chapter, argues, and he was writing basically in this time period, right? He was helping promote Yixing in the 70s and the 80s. and founded the Museum of Teaware, Flagstaff Museum of Teaware in Hong Kong. He writes, and I don't know if I agree with this, that F1 is the Grand Cru vintage, early F1s, or the Grand Cru vintage of Yixing, that they were able to take everything that they had learned through the dynastic period and turn that into a repeatable, reliable production site for great wares. And it's difficult to take that argument at face value, right? Having used Qing Dynasty wares, having used many ROC wares, there are pros and cons to the F1 wares. And so part of my thesis, something that Zongzun just ever so slightly touched on, is that idea of marketing and placement, right? Where you can say, oh, well, this teapot was by this individual, or this teapot was from this vintage. And so there's a little bit to the idea that F1 presents individuals with a puzzle, and a puzzle that they believe that they can solve, right? All of the teapots, just about all the teapots, are stamped Zhongguo Yixing, or some of them have the 6-character stamp, some of them have cover seals. And so you look at these things and you say, right, and then you look at the clay and you look at the shape and the size, and you say, ah, this must be a pre-77, mid-70s vintage, right? And I bet you it was by Gu Jinzhao, the Grand Master himself, right? And so on one side, because they all have the same seal, because these were made to specific specifications, it's so much easier for merchants to sell you a vision of what you have, right? Oh, well, this is a top level apprentice's teapot, and right, that was made using original mine 4 clay, the very first batch that they brought up. And because of that, because there's this puzzle form, right? You get to pick and choose your evidence and say, this is what I believe this is. And because the right answers may never be known, and because the merchants have an interest in promoting this, F1 is very prone to individuals falling into the hyperreal, to finding themselves believing that they do have something great, that this isn't just a craftsman pot, that this wasn't a late 80s dyed and colored and chromium packed pot. I have F1 teapots in my collection. There are F1 teapots that are great. My primary Chouzhou teapot for Chouzhou Gongfu is an F1 pot, and it's an amazing teapot. Do I think that canonically that they are the Grand Cru vintage of Yixing? I'll leave that unanswered.
I think there was a lot to unpack from what you just said, and I do agree that there's some level of collector's mindset. There are incentives from vendors and merchants, as you said, this knowledge puzzle that's out there to solve, and a degree of validation, not just validating the teapots, but validating your own ego and sense of self-worth, right, through collection of these wares, which require some knowledge and capital.
My last question. The transition from the late F1 period to the contemporary period was not without its own challenges. How did production of Yixing change, and how should practitioners evaluate F1 production from the 80s, the private productions in the 90s and the 2000s, and contemporary productions today?
So one of the good legacy of the collectivization of Yixing production is that all of a sudden, such a art form are made vastly accessible to the general public. More people know about drinking tea out of Yixings, and Yixing prices have gone down, which made more and more people to have the accessibility of the teawares. So moving from the privatization era of Yixing productions, you are seeing more variations of different types of productions, and more people are looking after different kind of teapots, different kind of clays, different kind of claims, different kind of aesthetic values, which sometimes not attributing to I wouldn't say legal or illegal, but certainly not probably healthy addition of certain materials into the clay, which changed the color or changed the performance of the teapot. So moving from the collectivization production of Yixing, there is certainly a change of regulation of production, right? a lot of the production processes are no longer highly regulated by the authority, which will lead to probably a more chance of miss a hit when you try to buy teapots, after that era, and especially nowadays. Nowadays in a city in China, when you walk into a random tea shop and you see a rainbow array of color of teapots sitting on the shelf, you probably need to think to yourself, okay, which of these teapots are safe to purchase and safe to use?
I think just to summarize it a little bit, because I think you touched on a lot of the aspects, Zongzun, we had a new frontier open with privatization, and where there was previously a very known quantity, you knew that the teapot you were buying was from F1. You knew that there was a clay of a certain level. You probably didn't know who was working on your pot, but you had a general idea, right, of who could have been. We then entered the Wild West. And I think all of those things that were quantitizable knowns become unknowns in the era of privatization. And I think large in part due to that, and many of the things that degrade the quality of Yixing production during those times, a lot of pots from those eras are not highly sought after. And while I'm sure there's many pieces that are to the contrary and are of high quality, I think this period of kind of, let's call it the late 80s into the mid 2000s, you've got a lot of Yixing that no one's looking for, no one really wants, and often are trying to be marketed or sold as something that they are not at this point.
There's a great debate right now. Are we in the golden age of Yixing? Is this now, today, contemporary Yixing production, the golden age?
If you have enough money.
If you know enough people.
So, Pat, you think it's economic capital. Zongzun, you think it's cultural capital.
Or a combination of both.
Yeah, it's both at this point. Well, you can, I'm sure you can throw down thousands of dollars, and if you don't know what you're looking for and you don't have the right connections, I don't think it'll go as far as if you do.
Now, I have a rebuttal to that, because I think there's a non-negligible chance we're living in the golden age of Yixing production, right? Does that mean that all of the Yixings that are produced are great? No, I think we're in a time of great variance. I think it's possible to accidentally buy a green-colored dye pot that someone tells you is Benshan Luni, and I think that there are a lot of questionable things on the market. I also think that in our experience, we've been commissioning some Yixing teapots. We have been astoundingly impressed with some of the clay we've been able to source. And that clay is not cheap, but it's not, this is not a massive outlay of economic capital. This is much more around the cultural and the social capital of knowing the individuals who care about their wares, who are not famous for artistic merits, they're famous for craftsmanship. And we've been able to help produce and source some pretty impressive wares, I would say, that stand up to some of the rest of my antique collection, and to the antiques that both of you, I hope that both of you have tried. So where does that place us, right? Is this just the standard? The internet makes everything possible and available. Unfortunately, most of what's possible and available is a bad, terrible idea that should never have existed and is a blight on humanity, right? And so you're looking at just that 5% of what's great in the world suddenly available to you because of the internet, or is this something different? Is there something else going on that means that we are in the golden age, or is there some refutation that means we're not in the golden age?
I don't know that we need to answer that, because as you said, right, we currently have some great pots that we've been commissioning, and compared to even trying to purchase, let's call it mid-level quality F1s, what we've been commissioning has been more affordable. And I think the performance has outperformed a lot of what I've experienced, at least with F1. Maybe not all of it, but quite a large portion of it. And it's not like I think we've maxed out our budget. I'm sure we could pay more and marginally get better and better pots if we so chose to, right?
Is it better and better, or is it rarer and rarer? Because at this point, isn't the argument that we're paying for the rarity of the clay?
That's a good question. I don't actually know, right? Because I think we've discussed before that a lot of the rarity of Yixing clay, right, is overhyped, and that yes, some of the highest quality Yixing clays are hard to come by, whether that's because of how much they cost, how much exists, or who you have to know, right, to source them. But come back to the original point, I don't know if I could say yes or no to us living in the golden age of Yixing at the moment. Are we in a better age of Yixing than we were 20 years ago? I think I can say yes to that pretty resoundingly.
And also frequently, right, like rarity doesn't necessarily translate it into quality. And we are nowadays certainly have more access to Yixing artists with very high techniques, with the recognition system that was implemented starting in the communist era, but really formalized in the 80s and to nowadays. Frequently, you are just one Taobao account away from a Yangao Yixing artist that can make you like really good quality teapots.
But we will leave it there. So the question to our subscribers and our listeners is, are we in the golden age of Yixing? Thank you for joining us in this edition of Tea Technique Editorial Conversations. Please join us again for our next conversation, an introduction to the production of clay ceramics.